as it's 7 o'clock, we should make a start. So I am delighted to welcome you this evening to the latest in our Alyth Online lectures. It's really lovely to have so many people with us once again. And these really have been one of the highlights of these past few months for us. Partly just experiencing the extraordinary depth and breadth of expertise in our community, but also the joy of getting an insight into what members of the community actually do for a living, the people who we share our religious life with, but so often we don't see what happens in the rest of their weeks. So it's a real joy to be able to experience that little bit more of what people do for a living. So that certainly applies this evening when Mike, who is such a regular part of our community, and certainly for those of us who are involved in leadership, has been such a support together with Ruth as we've been through recruitments and thought about HR and management in our community. It's wonderful to just be able to see a little more broadly what it is that he does and how he works. So as with all of our Alyth Online lectures, the best thing to do is to set your screen to active speaker view. And you can, of course, decide how many people you see in the corner of your screen. Ideally, you want to have Michael in the corner of your screen as well, as he'll take us through a PowerPoint for his presentation. And then depending how much time we have left, we'll have some questions as well afterwards. The promise is that we finish by 8 o'clock on these evenings so that people can get on with their evening. And as always, if you would like to ask questions of Michael or have me ask questions of Michael, then please feel free to email those to me at josh@alyth.org.uk. That's the way in which you can sort of feed in later on in the evening. So I'm really delighted to hand over to Michael, who's going to speak with us on 7 questions to release our potential at work.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us. We've all seen the headlines about COVID, issues about how many people have been dying, how many people have been affected. The latest thing is what's going on now in terms of reducing lockdown. There is, however, to my mind, a very important headline, which is still to be publicized and broadcast on the media. And that's COVID is disrupting over 50%. Significantly disrupting over 50% of the UK people's work lives. Just to give a few statistics to bring this out, there are currently, I understand, 2.1 million people actually unemployed. There are 8.9 million people who've been furloughed, of whom a significant number are going to be made redundant and lose their jobs, not to mention British Airways. They're also, from what I read about the statistics about small business loans, the banks have estimated that of the 300,000 small businesses that are going to take out government loans, and 300,000 are not going to survive. That suggests, quite simply, there is a very dramatic and far-reaching impact on people, more than any of us have experienced in our lifetimes. In other words, there'll be people out of jobs. There'll be lots and lots of people worried about if they're going to be out of jobs. And which brings me on to the point of this evening's seminar I hope I can provide some ways of thinking about what to do if you're facing that challenge and enormous conundrum of using your talents to earn a living. So, as I said, the approach it's to provide a systematic framework and approach to make best use of your life at work. I'm going to use 7 questions and explain why 7 questions to explore your work, career issues and options. Most importantly, or very importantly, these questions focus not only on stuff which is outside in the world around us, but very importantly on the stuff inside, our own feelings, our own emotions, our own dreams. So it's looking both inwards and outwards. So that's the purpose of this evening. And I hope that by the end of it, we've covered the 7 questions. So let me just make a comment. Some of you who know me will know that I have a great passion about mountains. So I've naturally shown a picture about mountains. I often think careers are a bit like mountains. Not only sometimes it's quite difficult to climb up, but also the path isn't clear at times, and we don't know which way to go. And as with mountains, sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's quite difficult. But one of the questions, so not one of the 7 questions, but an issue which we often face is, do we focus more on the destination or do we focus more on the journey? And of course, that shift between, is it where our work-life journey is taking us, or is it more about what we're doing now that we're really focusing on? And of course, over time, all of us, we might change in the emphasis we put on the destination of the journey. This is by way of context. So where did the 7 questions come from? A few years ago, a very large organization employing over 100,000 people in the UK asked myself and a colleague to design and implement a series of workshops to help the top 500 people in the organization manage their careers. And they put a lot of money into it. And the reason they run these workshops is because they came to the conclusion, after lots of effort and lots of people in management development have been working very hard, they said they couldn't manage people's careers. So they said, okay, the other option is get people to manage it themselves, get people to actually make the decisions about where they're going, how they want to handle their work life as individuals, and equip them to do that. So we ran this series of workshops over a number of years. We'd run the first 4 workshops with about 100 people in total in the first year. The perception was, this is working, it makes sense. And I was saying to myself, we need to have a formula, a framework in which we can get people to think about their careers. And I kid you not, but for a period of about 6 months, I was doing diagrams and flow charts and circles and arrows, thinking, let me see if I can put this together as a framework. I then decided this is going nowhere because I was confusing myself. So if I'm confusing myself, I no way could I articulate an approach to others. And after a lot of searching and thinking, I said, okay, well, perhaps we can produce the framework as a series of questions to help people think about their life at work. And you'll see this is quite a diverse set of questions. Just so you realize how significant they are, and my advice to people normally is take about 3 months to answer these questions. You'll see why. To check out that the framework made sense, I talked to a mentor of mine, Professor Adrian Furnham, and he said, yep, this makes good sense. In fact, we wrote an article about the framework. Since then, I've used the questions substantially when working with people to develop their careers, to develop their work life, both individually, one-to-one in coaching, and also in a series of workshops for different organizations. So that's where the questions come from. And the evidence is they work. So be interested in your reactions. Before we go into the questions, just a couple of things about, again, the context, the work trends. When I started my career, the implication was you're going to have a job or a type of job for life. That's out the window. Careers for life are out the window. One of the big things that's happened in the last probably 20, 30 years is the clear understanding that the only person really responsible for their work life and their career is themselves. It's you. It's up to you what happens in your life and at work, not up to your organization, not up to your family or other people who you're involved with. It's down to you. A third trend, quite fundamental. Years ago, the thinking was you have your learning early in your life. Once you've left school, once you've left college, then you go to work, and then that's the work life, and the learning is past. Of course, that's all history now, because we need to learn at every stage of our life, and even at the autumn of my work life, I need to learn. And it's been quite interesting for me. One of the things I've learned recently is how to use Zoom, or somewhat how to use Zoom. So we need to learn. In fact, one of the comments I make to people is when you stop learning, then it's time to pack up your work life, because if you don't leave, it'll leave you. Another big trend is increasing numbers of people are self-employed, often with a portfolio. So rather than just having one position, someone might be doing some project management part-time. They might also be working as a professional in another part. And so people have got multiple positions. And of course, it's the variety that's happening now. And when I look around me at the friends I grew up with, the friends of my contemporaries, many of us seem to have had about two significant parts to our career or our work life. Now people, by the time they're 30, many people have had 2 or 3 and more to come. A final thought: what makes people successful in managing their work life? I believe we can distill it down to 3 things. One is being highly determined and focused. A second thing is being open to introspection. In other words, we need to take stock of ourselves, not just once, but regular points in time, seeing how we're doing, how am I feeling, have my values changed, are my aspirations different? And the final thing is we need to be agile learners. So that's the sum of the trends. On to the questions. First question is, what are my dreams about my future life at work? I very purposely have chosen the word dreams because dreams are really, really important for us. I'm not talking about the ones we have when we're sleeping, although sometimes those things come out in when we're asleep, but I'm thinking about the dreams we have about life, about where we're going. And this is nothing original on my part. There are dozens of different dreams in the Bible. There's the classic one about Joseph's dream about his brothers bowing down to him. There's, of course, that fabulous speech Martin Luther King gave about I have a dream. And of course, my favorite psychologist, Shakespeare, he has lots of dreams described in his plays, not just Midsummer Night's Dream, but even Macbeth had a dream, however evil that was. But the point is about dreams is it gets us going. It makes us passionate. They make us excited. And having a dream is really important. Now, you might turn around and say, in the present climate, can I have a dream? Is it appropriate? I would say at the very least, you should have some goals, not just for the next job, but the job after. But a dream's even better. Because if you have a dream, you'll be passionate about it and you'll make it happen. So let me give some examples of dreams that I've come across in my work. I was running the workshop on managing careers and managing our life at work. And it was a group of senior middle management people there. And we're having a great discussion. We were sharing our thoughts and aspirations for the future. And one lady said, highly respected, very capable lady, said, actually, I'd love to become a florist. And we all thought, really? We hadn't expected that because of her experience and her track record. And she said, that's what I really want to do. And later on, a few weeks later, I had a one-to-one coaching session with her. And that really was her passion. Whatever she'd achieved, whatever the earnings were, whatever the success, she loved putting flowers together. She loved floral arranging. So, in fact, this was quite some time back, but I heard subsequently that she actually was running 3 florist shops. She was achieving her dream. Something completely different, I was doing some career coaching for, I'll simply say, a very experienced and a very well-paid lady. And she said to me, Michael, she said, I could carry on my current earnings level, but switch to taking on a number of non-executive director roles, or I could go for a chief executive role where I'll double my earnings. And we talked about it and we looked at her talents and the rest of it. And her conclusion was actually, she wants to go for the non-executive director roles. So I think the point I'm trying to make is the dreams are really, really important and they matter. And it doesn't matter what they are. Your dream is not for your parents or for your partner or for your kids or indeed anyone else you know. Your dream is for you. Let's go on to the next question. What are my values and lifestyle preferences? That's as important as the dream. And by values, I mean, what are the things that really keep you awake at night, or alternatively, things that get you excited? Now, there are many, many ways of looking at values. A way I use comes from a questionnaire called the Motives Values Inventory. And as you can see, there are 10 different values here. There are definitions, and we'll come on to them in a minute. But these definitions, this questionnaire is quite succinct, and it catches the values that really matter to us quite I believe, very, very powerfully. Just to give you a flavor why it's important. If I'm working with a search firm and actually assessing candidates to become chief executive, there are two things I'm looking for in their values. One is a reasonable amount of power, value, and the second is a reasonable score on commerce. Without those two, they won't make, I know for certain they won't make a successful chief executive. Completely different if I'm looking for someone who's going to be highly creative, highly innovative, someone who thinks out of the box. What I really want is someone who's high on science because they'll take account of data, but also someone who's very low on tradition, someone who's willing to rock the boat, someone who's prepared to challenge the way things are currently. They're also quite low on security because they don't want to be hidebound about worrying about their position and the rest of it. And also another thing which contributes towards creativity is that people have a squirt of a squirt of aesthetics. In other words, there's a bit of an interest in art and creativity. So the value stuff really matters. Oh, before I move on, there is another one which I came across when we've used this questionnaire to assess candidates for Alyth. What was significant, both in the successful candidates and the less successful candidates, they were all very high on altruistic. So in other words, this is about compassion. It's about wanting to make the world a better place. So it's not a surprise, but what I was surprised is quite how high the scores are. And from memory, there was none of the candidates we've assessed had less than about 70% on this. So this altruistic is clearly one of the attributes and characteristics of a rabbi, an aspiring rabbi. This isn't just a chalk and talk session. I'd like you to reflect and to think about which values matter to you most. I'd like you to identify one value out of the list of 10 which comes top of your personal priority. Now, we haven't got masses of time to go into detailed definitions. What I want you to do is scan the list with a succinct definition and put a tick in the box. You're very shortly going to receive a poll window on your screen. I'm going to give you no more than 20 seconds to look at that and to tick one item. Don't worry if it isn't perfect. We're not actually going to give feedback to anyone about what you personally said. What would be quite interesting is to see, well, let's look at the spread of emphasis on the different values in an Alyth population. So Adam, if you could please just show us the poll window. So if I can just mention, you can go up and down the window. If you on the right-hand side, you'll see the different items. So if you could just tick whichever one, but just one of them, to indicate which one is most important to you. And as I say, to make sure you get all 10, you can see all 10. There's a line on the right-hand side of the poll window. I'll just give it another 5 seconds or so, and then I'll end the poll. Okay, we'll end it now, and I'm going to ask for the results to be seen. And you can see just very, very quickly what it's come out as is the highest item, just scanning the list, is we have 21% who are interested in affiliation, who need social interaction. Want that. We have 21% who are interested in power. Then we have lower numbers for things like science, being data rational, and we have lower numbers for aesthetics, none for commercial, a very small number for tradition, and a smaller number for altruistic and for recognition. So that's just an example. That gives a quick snapshot of the values that might apply to people in Alyth. Of course, I know we could go into more detail, but I wanted to involve you to get a flavor. So that's the poll. But this stuff, we really can use it to measure things that matter. And of course, at an individual level, those values are really important. Just to make another, before we go on to the 3 talents, there is something I want to say about the values piece, and that is it's really important that, first of all, we have consistency between our values. So I remember working with, in fact, it was the daughter of a relative, and she had two passions. One passion was that she really wanted a serious career, and we talked about it in her professional field. And the other passion was she wanted to travel. And she said, and I said, what do you mean by that? I said, is it in holidays or? And she said, no, I'd like to travel for 6 months a year. And I said, well, that's wonderful. But on the one, there won't be many organizations that will help give you a serious professional job that also allow you to have 6 months a year off. I said, this might happen a bit later when you're more experienced and you've got a track record, but for now, these are incompatible. And she was quite unhappy with me confronting her on that. Interestingly, this is now about a year ago. She still hasn't resolved it. So get another example of the values. It's someone who I know, a lady who had lots of potential. She worked in one of the big 4 accounting firms, got pretty senior in finance. And she then, well, after she got married, she thought, well, what can I do? How can she resume her career? And what can she do? And she explored all sorts of options, which didn't come out very well. And then about 2 years ago, after another one of these options hadn't worked out, she finally came up with the values that really mattered. She said, actually, I want a job that I haven't got to travel far, that gives me hours from 9:30 to 4:30, preferably, so I can get home to my kids, a job which is interesting and which I don't mind. She said, I don't mind if it's demanding, but I need to work these hours. I can do a bit of work at home in the evenings. And what was fascinating is she ended up working in quite an unusual role, providing the entertainment in a care home. Okay, it wasn't quite a market care home, I hasten to add. But what was fascinating for me is that her real passion was to take care of her family and her kids. And therefore the work, although she was ambitious, she said, actually, that is less important than my value of looking after my family. So the values bit, there's a compatibility issue in terms of how do the values match up to the dream. I remember someone I coached some time back, and they were doing quite well in business, and they said, I'm thinking it might be quite good to become, I'd really love to become an artist. I paint a bit, I think I can really develop that. And we talked about it a bit more. And then the person said, I really would like to have a salary of 100,000 a year. And I said, well, I have to tell you, unless you're a fabulously good artist, you won't make that. And again, it's a trade-off. So the dream was to be an artist. The value, there's also a value bit about money. So there is a real need for these values and dreams to complement each other. And if there's a disconnect, then we need to either change the dream or refine the values. Question 3. I'm going to suggest to you this is the single most important question. What are my top 3 talents? When I'm working with people about their careers, about their future life at work, I have a very simple proposition. You will be most happy and fulfilled and successful if you consistently use your top 3 talents. And I mean top 3, because that's, if we do what we're best at, we have an opportunity to do what we're best at, we're both likely to be fulfilled and successful. And when I say best at, it means the areas we have a relative advantage over other people. Now, how do we think about our talents? There are many different ways. I know I've broken all the rules with slides, but I came up with a list of about 63 different talents a few years ago with a colleague, and we called it talent inventory. And we've used it to help, we use it extensively to help people think about their careers and their talents. Because the one thing that stands out is if I asked any of you, what are you good at? Nearly all of you could say at least a dozen things, and perhaps you could tell me 30 things. The top 3 talents are the most important, because those are the ones, and I kind of come back to it, that give you the competitive advantage in the labour market and in organisations. People will notice you for your top 3. So I'm just showing this list. I originally hoped we could do a poll with this, but the poll feature on Zoom doesn't accommodate 63 items. So I'll leave that list with you. If you're interested in it later, I can make sure you get a copy. So these talents are really, really important. Just to say another thing about the talents is they may not be obvious. I was giving someone some advice literally in fact 3 weeks ago. And we were talking about this young man's career and what he'd done. And he'd actually done a significant amount of work in the hospitality sector. And he'd become a bar manager, and then he became a manager of a number of restaurants and bars in the same company. And he'd been very successful at it. And of course, as we know, the hospitality sector's completely shut down. And at the moment, he's furloughed and he's been told he'll be made redundant before long. And he was saying, Michael, what can I do? And we talked about his career and his experience. And one of the things that actually came out when we talked about it was actually he'd done a lot of project management. And he'd set up completely from scratch 3 of the bars, which his organization had. He'd found the sites. He'd organized builders to renovate them and do them according to the style that was required. He ordered the equipment. He'd recruited the staff, appointed the managers to be in charge of them. And he'd done these in literally a matter of months. What was incredible was he has a real skill and talent in project management. So when we're talking about his career, one of the things that I suggested to him was actually go for project management. You won't get in much in hospitality in the foreseeable future. You may well have an opportunity in project management, particularly when you demonstrate how you've succeeded very well to set up these bar restaurants from nothing. So being clear about our talents, even though they're not obvious, a great thing to do is to ask your partner or someone who knows you very well. They're probably aware of some of your talents which you're not even aware of or not even know. They may also have another perspective. You think some things you have great talents in, and they say, no, actually, you're not very good at that. But that's another question. There's a part B to question 3, and that is, having identified your top 3 talents, how well do they complement your dream? And this can sometimes be quite daunting because, again, going back to it, you only make the dream happen if you've got the talent to make it happen as well. And so the top three talents are quite fundamental. So making sure they match the dream, but if they don't match the dream, being aware of that and saying, okay, how can you, it doesn't mean you need to have everything, all the talents required, but it might be that you have to say, okay, so I can make up for a talent gap in certain areas by doing certain things. We'll talk about how we can develop our talents in a moment. But this thing is, it needs to match the dream. So someone who says, I want to be an artist, and then you say, well, actually, how creative, where have you demonstrated your creativity? What feedback have you had? Unless the person has actually got a talent for being creative, whether it's painting or drawing or sculpture, whatever, unless they've got that, they can demonstrate that, then the likelihood of achieving success is pretty small. So making sure looking at the match between your talents and the dream is quite fundamental. One of the interesting thing is what might be worth just touching on, and that is, what are the dreams you had when you were a child? You may have had dreams which actually may have some relevance. They may not always have relevance, but they may have some relevance. And one of the things is to say, well, actually, is there a match between the talents you've since displayed and some of the earlier dreams? Let's move on to the fourth question. Okay, you've identified a talent gap, and the question is, how can you develop some of those talents to achieve your work-life goals? And that's a really important one, because again, it's perfectly appropriate. You may have some gaps, and you might say, I can do something about these gaps. And of course, I've given a list. It's not a perfect list, but I think it captures many of the more common ones. You'll notice taking a course is at the bottom of the list. that's very intentional, because the research that's been carried out suggests that actually attending a formal training course, interesting and stimulating as it might be, and we will learn something, but actually they're not the most powerful things to help develop our talents. The most powerful things from the research are the two top things. One is working for a capable manager, a manager who actually is sensitive to our own talents, stretches our talent, and actually gives us a workload, refines our job, to make use and to channel our talents. They can be immensely helpful in developing our talents. And the other thing, the option, of course, is to get a coach, to get a mentor, someone who will work with you to reflect, to take stock, to challenge you, to give you feedback. So the top two from experience are having a capable manager and a coach. The third item, I'm going to touch on that because tackling a project is a really interesting one. A few years ago, I did a project with a large firm of architects. There were about 1,000 people. And I was helping them put together to define the career structure in the organization. And we were looking at, well, how do we first of all define the paths to actually develop up to partner level? And one of the things we did is we talked to a number of different people who had been highly successful and progressed very quickly, some people who hadn't. One of the things that really stood out was the people who'd progressed fastest and most quickly were the people who had actually tackled all aspects of an architect's project, both from concept right the way through to final implementation. Now you might say, well, it's obvious, but actually it wasn't obvious to the practice because people would work very diligently on perhaps one or two phases of a project, but they may have missed some others. And one of the things that came out from the internal research we did was that it was essential that to progress rapidly in the firm, that you actually have the full range of experience across all stages of the project. You'll notice I've put in one of my favorite concepts, practice and JDI, just do it. There is a well-known version of that, JFDI, which I won't say any more about, but actually just doing stuff can make an enormous difference. Question 5, which job role options do I need to pursue to achieve my work-life goals? Now, anyone who's looking for a job, they will have jumped to conclusions very quickly about that's the next step I need. That would make sense. It might be something more of the same of what you're doing now. It might be something which is slightly different. But in fact, we have to think creatively about the options. And one of that, the example I gave earlier about the young man who'd been in hospitality, one of the things I said is, look, you need to think about a different sector. But also there are a whole raft of different things we can do. Obviously talking to friends, but the options are enormous. And it's stuff about leveraging our network. One of the absolute no-nos is to ask someone about, do you know where I can find a job? People don't want to know. If you say, can you give me advice about where I can get a job like this, or which organizations might have a job, or what, that's a different question. And people are very often very, very willing to give that, share that advice. But if do you know a job, even it's rare that people will respond positively to that one. And of course, the thing about becoming a freelance, starting a business, they're really important options. I will just share an option I did, which I found it wasn't so much an option, but I found it very, very helpful. Years ago, about looking at the worst case scenario. I think that's something it's very helpful to look at. It's tough. We have to look at some things that we may not want to look at, which we find quite difficult. I was working in a large American consulting firm, and I decided to take a 3-month sabbatical, and I went with Ruth and Zach. We went off to Mexico for a few months, and I'd left the telephone number of some friends who we went to occasionally as part of the trip. I left the telephone number at work, and but roughly halfway through, I phoned up our friends in Mexico City and said, just touching base, do we expect to be back in Mexico City in 10 days time, blah, blah. And they said, by the way, the office called. They would like you to call them urgently. Oh, all right. Phoned the office and they said, Michael, you're redundant. Bottom line. That was a bit of a shock. I'd spent quite a lot of my savings on this trip and thought, okay. 2 days later, we met for dinner in a local restaurant, an American couple who downsized. And we got chatting and they told us about their lifestyle and what they were doing and how and they were really proud of the fact that they downsized. And towards the end of the evening, I said, can I just ask you something? Do you mind if I telling me how much do you live on a month? And they said, oh, we get by very comfortably on $1,000 a month. And that was, oh, such a relief, because I turned around to Ruth. In fact, we both, she got it as well. We said the worst case scenario was we let the house in Highgate and we went and lived in Mexico on $1,000 a month. So I think the point is looking and if I was very lucky because the worst case scenario wasn't that worse, wasn't that bad. And in fact, often, not always, but often the worst case scenario isn't that, it's doable. And by looking at the worst case, we can say everything else is better. So the myriad of job role options around. Question 6. This is really having a big dive into ourselves. What personal baggage do I need to throw out of my invisible backpack? Let me explain what I mean by that. I have a hypothesis, belief, that all of us carry an invisible backpack with us all the time, day and night. And in that invisible backpack are our own dysfunctional beliefs, self-limiting beliefs, our own hang-ups, things like that. And like it or not, every one of us here has our own personal stuff in our backpack. The size of our backpack, that varies, but we all carry something. The origin of it is not so important. What's really important is to be aware of some of that stuff. And I think this is quite fundamental, because often by looking at the invisible backpack and the stuff in there, we can actually unlock some stuff, which actually makes it much easier for us to get that different position to move on with our work life. Just to share it with you, my own personal invisible backpack contains some stuff around I'm not good enough. Now, I'm not going to ask you to share what your invisible stuff is, but we all have some. We have a questionnaire, naturally, you'd expect nothing less of me. We have a questionnaire for looking at that. It's called the Hogan Development Survey, and it measures some significant dysfunctional behaviors. Now, what's interesting about this questionnaire, it measures, again, I haven't given the definition, but you'll get a flavor just from the name of them. But any of this list can be dysfunctional if we have it to a very high level. So for example, an obvious one is diligent. Being diligent, being hardworking, being persevering is a great asset. But if we are very, very high, top of the list, in other words, we devote nearly all our life to work, if we're working incredibly long hours consistently, after a time, that'll become really dysfunctional. And the same will apply to any of the others. Again, for example, being, well, I don't need to say anymore, it'd be obvious, but any of these to an extreme can actually really hold us back. Now, I just want to show you a profile of someone I did some career coaching with. This is someone who's middle-ranking person in the city, doing well, and their aspiration is they wanted to reach main board level. They'd done pretty well up to now, but they tried for a couple of years to move on and they hadn't been able to. And this person came, I'll simply say they came from an ethnic minority group. And one of the behaviors they had, you'll notice the two at the very high are skeptical and reserved. And this particular individual, you notice it's 98% skeptical. So this person, they were very, very cautious in believing people. They found it very difficult to trust people. And I remember when I gave this person feedback, they kind of, oh, I'm not like that. I really am not like that. And then we talked about it. I did some coaching with them, and then I passed them on to someone who became their regular coach. And this person has now begun to take this feedback on board, and they're working very hard to be a bit more trusting. And the feedback, in fact, I was talking to their coach a couple of weeks ago, and the coach said, actually, this lady's beginning to change her outlook because she's very conscious, she's aware of this skeptical tendency, and she's trying to pull it back. So I believe that'll actually enable this lady to make the breakthrough to achieve her dream. Now, as I'm quite keen on this stuff, I'm going to show you one of my favorite, really, really simple frameworks for looking at a personal baggage. It's called the drama triangle. Not surprising, there are 3 positions on it. Persecutor, rescuer, and victim. And these are incredibly powerful positions. And there's a framework, a behavioral psychological framework called transactional analysis. You may have come across a book. It's still one of the ones that's still available. Is Games People Play by Eric Byrne. It's still on the bookshelves and available on Amazon. And it touches on this stuff. And what's incredible is that the basic theory is that everyone has a favorite position on this triangle. Now, this may not manifest itself all the time. It may come out only occasionally or rarely, or may only come out when they're under high stress. But most of us have somewhere on this triangle that is our favorite position. And I look at the people I know, and many of them I say, yep, that's where the person is on the triangle. And of course, you know, we often joke about the classic Jewish mother. Well, of course, she's a rescuer. So this drama triangle stuff, again, if you're having this dive into your look at yourself, you're looking at your personal baggage, have a look at the drama triangle. It's simple, easy to understand, but it's very powerful. And it has a real impact on what we do and how we approach both life and, very importantly, work. Last question. You probably thought I'd never get to the end. Who can help me on this life journey? This is the last question intentionally, and it's the question to help you kind of think on the next stage. Now, there are all sorts of people. The obvious, the family and friends. Some people say, I can never ask my manager about what I really want to do. Well, not all managers. Some managers will be very happy to talk about people's careers. And they might say, yeah, I know you don't really love being here, but actually, I know your aspiration is to go somewhere else. And again, you can share that with them. They may help you. You might go to a specialist. You might go to a coach. Of course, social media, LinkedIn. I mean, it's quite surprising. I mean, I don't actively use LinkedIn, but I get emails regularly about jobs I could apply for, which I don't particularly want, but this stuff works. And of course, don't forget strangers. An encounter with someone we don't know, you might suddenly think, hey, this person, they might be connected to such and such or know something, and they can help me. So that they're really important. And it may be people we've never thought of. And you may be surprised at how many people you've got who actually can help you on the journey. So my concluding comment is, you have the power to influence your work-life destination and your journey. And my question now is, what will you do now about it? Thank you very much for your time and for listening. I'm leaving as a last thought is some resources which you might want to look at for further information. I'll be pleased to take any questions.
Michael, thank you. It's really a wonderful presentation, and also wonderful just to get more of an insight into the work that you do and the way that you conceptualize work. So one of the things I was really struck by is the way you present work is as a meritocracy. Is that talent and reflection is going to result in progress. And I know that one of the things you also do is you see a lot of what's happening in the business world. So is talent enough? I mean, how relevant? It's particularly present at the moment, but how relevant to issues of sex and ethnicity? It can't be talent alone, or this process alone, that means that so many of our businesses are dominated by white middle-class men with backgrounds like mine.
And mine as well.
Right.
Well said. Let's put it this way. I think there is overall a meritocracy in the world of work. What I will also say is it isn't exclusively an entirely meritocracy. Sometimes it can be as much as sometimes luck. And luck is, as often said, oh, I was lucky because I met someone or I was talked to about this and suddenly I got this promotion offer. Yes, of course. But I would say that the meritocracy bit, and it's something we can influence. It's something we can use. If there are people who are prejudiced against us for whatever reason, our color, our background, it's much more difficult to do something about that. But again, our invisible baggage, as the person I mentioned from the ethnic group, minority group, being aware of how we're reacting to being a minority group, for example, that can influence how we handle prejudice and indeed unfairness.
Um, so I completely hear that. I suppose one of the questions for me is, in your experience, is it enough though? I mean, do you really believe it's a meritocracy? Um, Actually, want to ask that question first. Do you really believe it's meritocracy?
Largely. I
Okay.
would say that largely in the organizations I work with, meritocracy counts considerably. I would say, give me a percentage, I would say that counts for 60%.
And but do those meritocracies reflect certain kind of cultural assumptions and ways of thinking about work which maybe aren't so responsive to diversity? I suppose that
Exactly.
would be my question. So one of the interesting things someone asked is, do different people of different sex respond to these seven questions in different ways, for example? Is the way that people conceptualize work different? I mean, underpinning that, is there a fundamental need to rethink some of the ways in which work works in order to have more diversity, because the model that you present actually lends itself to people with backgrounds like mine and yours?
Well, it lends itself to people who believe in a meritocracy and are comfortable working in a meritocracy. There are people clearly who aren't. And as I said, I mean, for example, if I think of one of different organizations I've worked with, there's some organizations I work with which are much more of a meritocracy than others. I mean, there's some organizations which are essentially bound up in history and tradition, and, for example, that are ruled by a number of grandfathers who did make all the decisions, and people in the organization don't have any, or they have minimal power to make decisions. So this concept of a meritocracy, as the organizations aren't pure meritocracies, but what we do have is, I believe, overall meritocracy applies increasingly to organizations. And the second point is the extent to which meritocracy applies is largely influenced by culture, both the culture of the organization and indeed national culture as well. So one of the big thing that's come out, of course, is quite how much prejudice against black people there is in the US and, of course, the UK. And that's real.
Right. Um, so kind of probing that a little bit more, when you've done this exercise with a diverse range of people,
Mm.
can you see patterns in the way that people approach this kind of exercise? Do women and men approach these sorts of questions in different ways?
That's a very good question. I'm not going to bullshit. I don't actually know. What I know is it's very much an individual thing. So, for example, for some people, the awareness of the stuff in the invisible backpack, it's, oh my God, I hadn't realized that's what's holding me back. And they address that. For other people, it might be, gosh, I really don't realize what my best talents are. And therefore, if I can use more of that, other people, it might be, gosh, I really haven't used my contacts and people who I know to full effect. So what I would say is, and that's again the reason why I've said seven questions, because the emphasis you put on the seven questions is entirely individual. So what I have found is that different people react differently to each question. And again, the weighting they put, I don't put an emphasis on this question's most important, this is least. What I would say is it's up to the individual to decide which question is most important for them.
Right. I suppose that's it. It's interesting that those patterns aren't obvious, because I think one would assume that certain things, reflective practice, for example, would be
Mm.
things where you could see patterns in people's backgrounds as to their ability to engage with those kinds of questions.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting to me that those things don't stand out for you. It's very interesting.
I only see them in terms of as an individual, not in terms of groups. What I would say, and that is, I know that um, reflection, reflective learning is something that's really important. For example, at Alyth, among you as professionals. But and again, there are some organisations where it's not done to look at your inner stuff. I've worked in organisations where it's an absolute no-no to look at your weaknesses or things that might be holding you back. That's just not. You just don't do it in that organisation.
Right. So, and how easy is it for, because obviously one of the things you also do is work with organizations rather than just individuals. How
Yeah.
easy is it for people to uh, enact organizational change? So, if you were coming into a company and saying, actually, one of the things that's really important is that we are introducing reflective practice in the way that we think, that we are getting better at feedback, that we are able to have kind of a more sort of radical candor in our business. How easy is it to make those sorts of changes? Because you've been focusing on the person, the individual and their career, but of course it's happening in a context
Yes.
of trying to apply for of companies and what's happening in those companies.
Um, I think first of all, let me make a comment about culture change. I've worked with organizations on culture change over many years. I'm absolutely convinced you don't make significant culture change, even with the best will in the world, in less than about 3 years. So consciously, I mean, it might be that an external event forces an organization to change, in which case it could happen quicker. But typically, if you're working internally to try and achieve culture change, we're talking about a 3-year journey. Some other professionals say it's a 7-year journey. So this really does take time. Just to give an example, something I did earlier in my career was work with organization. This was in the early 90s. Work with organizations, something called the assessment and development centers. They were not in the vogue at all. They're now common practice, and lots of organizations use them as the basis of selecting people from outside and also for developing people internally. Now, what we found was, in fact, there's one big financial services organization I worked with, and we did a program of assessments and development centers where basically the idea was we put people through a series of exercise, job activities, which replicated what a typical senior or middle manager or senior role was. And we took, over a period, again, this was probably about a couple of years, we took lots of people through this experience and we gave them very robust feedback. So we might say to someone, looking at the way you performed on this exercise, we noticed there's a dearth of planning. You don't typically plan the way you handle things. And giving people that feedback was, oh my gosh, no one's ever given me that sort of robust feedback. But the really interesting thing was the time it took for that organization to take on this concept of observing people doing their job in some detail and giving people feedback. I would say it probably took that organization about 5 years to actually start adopting this thing about we will actually look at people's behavior and start giving people feedback based on what we've observed. So this takes time.
And is your sense that the kind of the world of work is beginning to be more open to those kinds of practices? I mean,
Oh
are you
yeah.
seeing more of it? You're seeing more of it, and
Oh, yeah.
because it works.
I mean, assessment and development, the most powerful, accurate way of predicting someone's success in future is through an assessment or development center.
Right.
And that takes a lot of time, it's expensive, but it works. And it's the by far the way, all the evidence is by far the most effective and powerful way of assessing people's potential.
Right.
And organizations are increasingly adopting stuff like this. I mean, just like I would say now, they're probably of larger or mid-sized and larger organizations, probably about half of organizations around are using things like psychometric questionnaires. Um, that's so it's not unusual at all.
Right.
But 20 years ago, it was still quite a novel, newfangled thing. So the answer is this stuff's happening more and more.
Right. So let's turn back. We've got about 5 minutes. Let's turn back to the individual and to the questions you've suggested. So I was really struck by the fact that your first two questions are about not about capabilities, but about values and aspirations and dreams.
Yeah.
The implication being that work is actually that something that should work for us, should give us joy, should be something that we find rewarding. Um, it, how real is that? I mean, I think one of the I suppose there's this interesting question, which is that so many people find work disempowering and unfulfilling, and work in order to live rather than
Yeah.
finding it joyful. Um,
Good question. Good, very good question. Um, pre-COVID, if you'd said to me, someone's working to live and they don't enjoy their work, I'd be saying, well, let's look at what you have enjoyed out of your time at work, or indeed in your life, and see if we can identify some things, some elements which you can build into a role. I mean, there's a lovely, one of my favorite anecdotes. It comes from NASA, and they were interviewing people in NASA, and they did an interview of the supervisor of the toilets. It's a well-known story. And this guy, and the guys doing the research went up to him and they said, what's your role here? And he said, I'm helping to put a man on the moon. And yeah, and they said, what do you do? Well, I actually make sure we have great toilets. They're really clean, they're fit for purpose, they're hygienic, there are no germs, the rest of it. This guy took real pride in cleaning the toilets. And that was, if you think about it, that's important. So I guess what I'm saying is, for almost every single job, there will be some redeeming features. And wherever you are in work life, my challenge is identify some. It doesn't mean you like everything, even the best jobs. I mean, I consider myself very privileged. I've mostly enjoyed my career immensely, and my work immensely. But I've had to do some stuff I really don't like and dislike doing. So one of my comments is, wherever you are in work life, see if you can identify some stuff that you enjoy, and see if it's possible to do more of that. Doesn't mean you can suddenly go from doing 10% to doing 90% of it. But if you can go from 10% to 30%, you're already making a significant and worthwhile improvement in the quality of your life, work life.
But of course, that requires talent. That requires training and support and counselling and guidance, and in order to learn how to do that for yourself, I suppose.
Yes, but
Right.
the idea of the 7 questions is to make it a bit easier and a bit more accessible.
Right.
You don't have to have a one-to-one coaching session or a series of one-to-one coaching sessions. In fact, the article I wrote with Professor Furnham, we called it Career Coach Yourself. So the answer is, by making this stuff more available, it actually becomes it's more open to lots of people.
Right. So just in the last question, I know that you don't want to you're not sort of an expert on the whole world of work, but are you seeing particular trends? I mean, what's the future of work? What are the things you think we're going to see? What should we be preparing ourselves for in terms of the world of work? And I suppose recognizing that we're living longer, recognizing that we're entering a period of economic uncertainty, recognizing that there are these radical changes coming about with technology. Do you think we're just going to have to change the way we conceptualize work as well?
Great question. I wish I had a total answer to it. I don't. One thing I will say is, I use that phrase, and being an agile learner is really important. I think being open to learning and seeking to learn is increasingly important. And as wherever we are in our work-life journey, it's absolutely essential that we're open to learn, not just from people who say, by the way, here's a new approach, but actually open to learning stuff that we may not come across specifically in our work, but things which may be relevant, which we find out on the news or comes up from conversations with other people. So in fact, it's often been said, the single most important talent is the ability to learn. So I would say that, and I think what's happened in the last 6 months in this year are a fabulous demonstration. Being an agile learner is really, really important, because there's going to be more versions of COVID, whether it's another pandemic or something similar. There's going to be more shattering stuff around in the years to come. And the best way to countenance that is through being a great learner.
Great. Michael, thank you. It's great to hear about your work and to hear your insights over the last hour. Thank you so much. We're going to continue doing these Alyth online lectures all the way through till to the penultimate week in July. So we're going to go all the way towards the end of July and then have a little break in August. So the next 2 weeks, in 2 weeks' time, Gordon Higgett is going to be speaking about St. Paul's Cathedral. as many of you know, we have the world's leading expert on the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral is a member of our community. So he's going to be sharing his knowledge for us in a couple of weeks' time. And next week, our member Shani Orgad, who is a sociologist and professor in the Department of Media and Communication at LSE, is going to be speaking on a book that she wrote last year. One of the things about these lectures is that they've suddenly, almost everyone has turned out to suddenly be incredibly relevant. And there was a report today that said that the nature of women's work and women's careers has shifted back to 1950s patterns as a result of COVID. And one of the country's leading experts on gender inequality in the home is Shani Orgad. So she wrote a book called Heading Home, which was all about sort of structural forces producing gender inequality in things like housework and the way that homes work. So that's a not to be missed next week at 7 o'clock next Thursday. I wish you all good evening. And once again, Michael, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us this evening.
Pleasure.